We're going to let in our next speakers. I'm sure many of you are excited about this panel. We're going to have Tom Bell, we're going to have, there he is, Lotta Moberg, Mark Lutter. The panel is going to be, and Jim Coleman actually. The panel is going to be moderated by Aleksa Burmazovic. Let's wait until we have Lotta, Mark, Tom, Aleksa. Where's Jim? Jim, I see you in backstage. And please, Tom, there you are.
Hi, I'm Mark Lutter. I'm the founder and executive director of the Charter Cities Institute. So we are a think tank that helps basically develop the legal framework for charter cities, new cities with a special jurisdiction like Singapore, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dubai. And we're also working on the ground in Zambia with Nkwachi. I believe Muya presented yesterday, as well as in Nigeria with Enyimba Economic City, the new city development in Abia State, as well as E, who also presented yesterday his Talent City project. So I guess I'll just, we can go around the room.
I'm Lotta Moberg. Thank you, Mark, for that thumbs up. I am a researcher of special economic zones for a while. I did my PhD at George Mason University writing on the topic, and I published the book Political Economy of Special Economic Zones. So it's dear to my heart. Nowadays, I do macro investments based in Chicago with William Blair, which is a local company.
I'm Jim Coleman, and my position is head of economics at WSP. WSP is a big global engineering-led advisory company. I have done a lot of work on SEZs over the years. My work is usually around the economic strategy, business plan, industrial strategy for zones in many different places, including high-income developed world places like the Gulf states, China, but also low-income sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia as well. So a lot of my work is really around the economics of making an SEZ work in whatever context it's in.
Hi, I'm Tom W. Bell. I am a professor of law at Chapman University in Orange County, California, and I'm the author of this book, Your Next Government. I'm going into the studio next week to record an audiobook version of this. So there's going to be a new and improved an audio version soon. And Lotta's holding up her book, also good. And what else? I am an advisor to Pronomos, Patrick Friedman's investment fund. I'm the academic director of the Institute for Competitive Governance, which is a think tank and project of the Startup Societies Foundation, which is dedicated, as you can imagine from its name, to increasing competition in governance. I'm legal advisor to the Seasteading Institute. Joe Quirk has given or will give a talk, I've forgotten the schedule, about a very interesting project that TSI, the Seasteading Institute, is involved in Panama, and I'm helping them with that. And I have my finger in a few other pots, but that's enough to get us started.
Right on. Thank you, everybody, for your introductions. Aleksa, I will be filling in Thibaut Salet, who's unfortunately not able to moderate this panel today, so I'll be doing my very best to keep this discussion nice and fruitful. Now, as the title of the segment that we're in right now is Innovative SEZs to Regrow the Global Economy, there's several segments to that we can go into. Number one would be the global economy, innovative SEZs. And to go in first, I kind of want to go directly to our most recent addition to our SSF roster, which is Jim Coleman. I'm quite interested in hearing about the most interesting, sorry, not the most interesting, but the most visible effects that this COVID crisis has had on special economic zones. And if possible, I'd like to hear about the invisible effects yet to come that we can expect in this industry.
Okay, so that's a big question. I think, yeah, at the moment it's kind of difficult to determine what kind of effects COVID is having on SEZ right now, and trying to separate that from the effect on the economy generally, I think is quite difficult. So I think what's happening to the general state of economies in different countries is going to directly affect SEZs. I think what we're all struggling with at the moment is, things like the operation of supply chains, the continuing operation of value chains. And over the last 20, 30 years, those have all become highly globalized. So in developed world countries, like I'm sitting in London, in the UK, we have a lot of manufactured goods, we have food supply, we have all sorts of things coming from all parts of the world. And what we make here is really very, very kind of precision-driven, high-value kind of goods and products. Everything else kind of comes in from other places. We're part of these big supply chains. And right now we are thinking, was that a good idea to completely globalize all of these things that come into our country? So the first thing that happened with COVID in the UK, everybody rushed to the toilet, and everybody rushed to the supermarket and bought toilet paper. Where does our toilet paper come from? It comes from all these other places. And I think all of these concerns are driving a kind of a thinking around, globalization versus localization. Should we really be localizing parts of these supply chains and value chains? Because what COVID has demonstrated is a lack of resilience in a lot of the industrial and economic systems globally. And it doesn't really matter what the developmental status of your country is, it's affecting all of us. And I think this is going to be one of the policy drivers for kind of SEZs going forward. How far does an SEZ in a particular location exploit what was a process of globalization in order to bring new things in, new kinds of industrial activities, extend the value chain in the country, create new jobs in the country? But it was kind of on the basis, particularly in the developing world, on the basis of the rest of the world quite happy to globalize and quite happy to adjust business models in the face of that. But that, I think, is going to be questioned now, and it kind of goes back to the original objectives of an SEZ in a particular location about diversifying the economy, extending value chains, increasing knowledge transfer, creating jobs, creating a lot of jobs. One of my fears, I think, with COVID-19, particularly in the developing world, where SEZs were driving the creation of new employment for rapidly growing cities, big populations, young populations, one of the ways to create resilience in a productive system is maybe to automate it, because then you don't need to worry, it can carry on irrespective of the shock. That might suppress the ability of zones in particular locations to create new jobs, for example. And these kind of policy drivers are going to have to be explored. And I think at the moment there's a lot of uncertainty. Where it all lands, I think, remains to be seen, and will be driven in part by how quickly it takes us all to come out of the lockdown and all of the implications on the economy that have come with that. Sorry, that was a slightly rambling response to your question. So.
No, I think that's perfectly appropriate. Else want to ramble in response to that, perhaps?
I think that SEZs are under a lot of pressure because trade in the world now is plummeting in the rate that we have not seen as long as I've lived, but in a very long time. And I think that the result of this is a more rapid progress in the development that we're already seeing. So the traditional special economic zones is very much just manufacturing hub. It's like an industrial park. It's got a fence around it. Nobody lives in there. Regulations are usually not different. It's just a tax cut. And you have a lot of these zones all around the world. We benefit a lot of them being in Latin America, fairly close, and it's a lot of textile manufacturing. There are two trends that I think are important that I think COVID would speed up. One is it has been increasing sophistication in these zones. Less textile, less just government saying, hey, we're going to build you all this infrastructure, more higher tech things such as medical manufacturing. And that is going to be, I think that's going to boom. There's going to be more of a demand for things like that. I think the demand, we can talk about more broadly the economy if we want, but like the demand patterns changing a lot. And I think that we're going to have less fast fashion and more things like medical equipment. And we're already seeing those things being supplied, especially economic zones. We're going to get more of that. And I think the second one, too, is a general trend also that we've seen, a recognition that tax cuts are not the way to go to economic development in these zones. It really is about innovation. And often there, it's about the government allowing for different regulation, often less regulation. And I think that the demand for coming up with solutions. I mean, we're seeing this in terms of ventilators and masks and gloves and everything that they want these companies to produce? Often the answer is we'd love to, but there's dysregulation holding us back. And I think that is something that where especially economic zones too can play a very big role.
We cracked 120 viewers of this main stage, which I'm very happy with. And Tom, I leave it to you.
Oh, I'll just share an anecdote that I think reflects on COVID-19 and special jurisdictions. I think it's fair to say with many polities, the scale is wrong. We see that in California. There's been a statewide lockdown. California is a huge state. It's the most populous state in the United States. It's got an economy the size of France's. And the governor imposed a statewide lockdown. They just don't have the infrastructure to enforce that. So yesterday I was in the streets of San Clemente, my hometown here in Orange County, with a lot of other protesters because the governor targeted Orange County to shut down only its beaches this weekend, because last weekend people in Orange County were out enjoying the beaches. And it's a great story for a lot of reasons, but what it shows is this crisis is not the right scale, or rather polities are not the right scale for this crisis. That's just one example. And I think Orange County is a fine size, but really even it is probably too big to handle this problem well. So the crisis is pushing communities to a size that works for the problems in front of them, and that's going to be smaller. That means more SEZs.
I kind of want to refer to something that both Jim, Lotta, and Tom mentioned. Jim mentioned something about automation and the policy within these zones. Lotta had also mentioned certain few things about policy. And Tom, now that you mentioned the devolution of these legal decision-making systems down to a lower level, particularly zones, there's a question that I'd like to direct to Mark Lutter now, who we haven't heard much from during this panel, and that is I've been observing recently that, say, the UAE, the Emirates, have had very interesting policies in their free zones. And what they've done is they've created a very interesting legal precedence in which people who work inside the free zones are now able to contract with other companies, not only in the same free zone, but also in other free zones inside the Emirates. And other than that, people who, as I'm sure you know, 70% of all people who are employed in the UAE are expats. And a lot of these people actually left the UAE as COVID became a thing. So the question that I want to ask Mark is, do you see zones in the future expanding more toward this kind of non-physical aspect of things, where these zones in the UAE right now allow companies to register within the zone and operate out of the zone without ever having to step foot physically inside the zone or present physical documentation or something like that? I'm interested in what you think.
I think that's a trend that we're going to see. We're already seeing it, for example, with the Estonia e-residency program. So there's basically going to be what I would describe as an unbundling of the traditional services of a state, right? We typically think of a state as providing this bundle of goods, things like security, national defense, a social welfare system, laws and regulations, and that's going to be unbundled. So Stripe Atlas, for example, has a program. It allows you to register a business in Delaware very easily. It just costs $500. Estonia's e-governance system is doing that, and I think we're going to see a general unbundling of a lot of these services. But I also want to, I think, return to the previous question you had, because I think, right, if we think about COVID and general supply chains, they exist in, to a certain extent, a geopolitical world, right? And the world has basically been U.S. dominated either since 1945 or 1990, depending on how exactly you want to define it. And what we're seeing increasingly is obviously China sort of challenging that post-war U.S. Pax Americana, American hegemony. And so you saw this about a month ago, for example. There were calls in some Chinese newspapers to restrict drug exports to the U.S. as a way to sort of punish the U.S. India restricted drug exports of, I believe, 16 drugs or ingredients to drugs. And so, right, basically what we're going to see moving forward is changing governance structures, because governance has existed within this U.S. defense umbrella. And as this U.S. defense umbrella effectively breaks down, it becomes a bipolar world. We're already seeing, for example, discussion of a scramble for Africa. And the only reason that there is a new scramble for Africa is because basically these governing institutions that used to keep what might be called this general sort of political framework in Africa are breaking down. And so it's allowing this opening for countries like China Turkey, Russia to be investing in Africa to strengthen their geopolitical position. And what that has to do with basically special economic zones is there aren't going to be like special economic zones qua special economic zones. They are going to be used to a certain extent more as, I believe, geopolitical tools. As, for example, China is using the Belt and Road. They have, I believe it's Hammurabi Port in Sri Lanka that they now have a 99-year lease for. I think the second large unmentioned aspect of the change that COVID is going to bring is basically a lot of emerging markets are dependent on commodity prices. So Nigeria, for example, is a oil producer. Zambia is a copper producer. These falling commodity prices are going to really basically destroy the budgets of these countries. And what that is going to do is lead to more opening of the discussion and a wider sort of interest in alternative forms of revenue generation. And so if, right, like you can come with a clear proposal, hey, give us these deep concessions to build a city, I think the countries that are seeing their revenues decimated will be more open to that. And this sort of harkens back to the late Middle Ages, the original, like, quote unquote, charter cities, where a city was granted a charter from the king in order to basically collect taxes because the king didn't have enough capacity to collect those taxes themselves. And so much of Africa, for example, less than 10% of the population pays taxes. The tax base is very small. Without the resources from commodity prices, they will need to diversify the revenue base, and that will allow for more institutional forms, so long as they believe that these institutional forms will drive revenue over the sort of longer time horizon and allow them to better shore up their capacity.
To continue on the questions that Mark had raised.
I think it's a very interesting point about the alignment of the geopolitical rationale for establishing an economic function or a physical function in a country, and the economic rationale. And I guess these things are always in tension to a certain extent. And I mean, you do see a lot of developed world power in Africa trying to develop and create influence and maybe create routes to markets. And I just wonder, I think they're going to be, the way these different tensions and the way these different kind of trends play out, it's going to be very interesting to see. It's difficult to kind of predict at the moment because, yeah, the whole thing Mark's point about commodity prices is absolutely correct. A lot of, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, has been dependent on those commodity prices. They've gone through the floor. They've gone beyond the floor. And what do they do? How do they generate economic activity? The work I do in African countries very much around trying to create or accelerate economic growth in order to absorb really rapidly growing populations and urbanizing populations. And SEZs are one way of generating the volume of employment. But if that is done with kind of geopolitical kind of objectives in mind by the kind of the external investor versus the domestic need to do things to the economy to give it this absorbing capacity, I don't know where those tensions end up in different places and how that's going to how it's going to play out. And at the same time, you may be getting, the old US-based geopolitical world maybe looking to withdraw slightly from globalization, or maybe a lot from globalization, perhaps on the part of the current US administration. And what does that do then? Does it leave a vacuum? And I think in terms of, if we go back to the original objectives of the SEZ around export earnings, diversification, create employment, create positive social impact through making the economy more sophisticated, maybe those objectives kind of get lost in all of this. And that would be one of my fears, I think.
Yeah, I can be brief. On the geopolitical one, I mean, one big elephant in the room here will be China. And regarding kind of touching on things that Mark said, it's still unknown, I would say, whether China is going to take a bigger or a smaller role. And the two things I think that we should be watching is, one, what is the narrative about how successful China is at beating the virus? They're creating a narrative now that while they're probably having millions and millions of new cases, they're pretending that they don't have any new cases. And if they can sustain that image of, hey, an authoritarian state like ours can do this better. And I think that that's probably true in that they can actually whip people into going to the factories and work, even if they don't like it. You can have more GDP growth as a result, and therefore a safer place, as well as a safer place to have a zone. The counter effect to that will be what the narrative is about the origin of this virus and whether China unleashed it on the world. Because you're actually seeing lawsuits now against China from some countries coming along, and that if that leads to sanctions, that is of course going to be a headwind for them.
I'll address the international issues too really quickly. I'll be so bold as to make a couple of predictions. One, Chinese SEZs are going to wither on the vine as the Chinese empire suffers a collapse. If you study Chinese history, it goes through these periods of grotesque agglomeration at the center and then fracturing. It tends to happen when they have a lot of unmarried, underemployed young men, which is exactly what they have right now. The other prediction I'll make is this is more hopeful than what I think might happen, but it would be great if the United States woke up and realized China's winning friends, not everywhere, but they're winning friends in a lot of places because they're going out and building commerce. America's foreign policy is basically we come in and either we bomb you or we give you a lot of money so we can go bomb those people. That is not a sustainable model for a number of reasons. I think at some point, Americans in power are going to wake up and realize, wow, all this money we're spending on bombs, we could spend on growing the American economy and bringing commerce to parts of the world that the Chinese have now walked away from because they can't sustain, just like they didn't want to sustain their treasure ships. They don't and won't want to maintain these far scattered SEZs because they're going to collapse inward. Those are my bold predictions.
And it remains to be seen whether or not they'll realize, but with your history of authorship, your predictions do come true. The next question that I kind of wanted to go into was that in the period preceding COVID, we were seeing kind of a nuclearization and very slow beginning of deglobalization among countries. So we were seeing various tariffs being brought up, etc. And I was wondering if, say, Lotta, from the economic point of view, could help us understand if zones are going to start moving into a nuclearized physical trade paradigm in which they no longer are part of global supply chains physically, but where the digital aspect of things moves ever more globalized, if that makes any sense.
I'll try to hit on it. Others might be filling in. I think that special economic zones generally have in the past played the role of mitigating these kind of headwinds. So we had, for example, in the U.S. With the Great Depression, we got the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and as response to that, they were lobbying towards the U.S. government to start what we now have, the foreign trade zones in the United States. And that was very much a way to saying, hey, we're not going to survive here, the ports, and so that they could actually have this exemption to the tariffs. And it could certainly be a way to also mitigate trade wars, policies that are not coming from within, but hey, we're having problems now, lobby the Chinese government, let's create these zones to alleviate some of the stress. There could be a lot of ways to do that, absolutely. I think a lot of that, again, will come from maybe the regulation part, seeing that the trade war hampers a lot of solutions, and that could just be a long list of various things that we can think about what they might use the special economic zones for.
Just to follow up, I think the way this plays out is probably going to be very different in different places. I think some SEZs are in locations where they are able to generate a very high degree of specialization in particular types of goods. And Lotta talked earlier about medical instrumentation and healthcare related goods. And I think specialization, deep specialization, even if it's deeply localized specialization, it still gives you a big comparative advantage and competitive advantage in terms of being global. And I think this is one of the things that where SEZs are successful in being able to create that differentiation, the specialization. You do a thing that's of great value globally, but you do it. You have the intellectual capital, you have the technology, you can do it. then you're going to remain part of big global supply chains, even if places are trying to localize, I think. And again, it's kind of the extent to which an SEZ, the policy around that is about, this kind of degree of specialization, or whether it's much more broadly about just generating economic activity per se in order to absorb growing populations, for example. And I think I think there's probably going to be a kind of a battle or a race to specialize, to become more specialized in order to still kind of contain or coordinate, have a coordinating influence over some of these big supply chains. But then there's another question about, if you are part of that, does that compromise your resilience in the face of a shock? I think. I mean, the other thing about the localization process, I think it's also about the kind of shock that industrial structures were preparing themselves for. Everybody was expecting that the big shock was going to be climactic. So everything was around climate change policy, mitigating, adapting to climate change, and expecting that kind of shock. We're all going to get flooded, let's build a big wall as an engineered response. But the shock turns out not to be climactic. It's actually a global pandemic. And ironically, that's actually quite good for the climate, because we're not driving around as much as we used to. That's the great irony. And I think the part of this is about SEZs being able to kind of create resilience against shocks per se, irrespective of where they come from, and this kind of alignment of the localization push with the ability to specialize and still be dominant in global supply chains.
So on the note of bold predictions, I'd like to make one. Going forward, a lot fewer people will care about global warming. And the basic logic is, like, regardless of the pandemic, assume we exit the pandemic in 18 months with a vaccine, everybody holds hands and sings Kumbaya. The conservative critique of the sort of global warming movement has always been that the problem isn't necessarily the emissions in the US and in Europe. Those are a problem, but those have plateaued since the early or mid-90s, depending on what numbers you're looking at. The challenge always basically comes from, okay, China's industrializing, India's industrializing, Africa is hopefully in the early stages of industrializing, and a lot of these emissions are going to come from those places. And basically the idea that you can solve this global public good depends on a functioning international order. Right, even before the crisis, there was the belief that it was challenging, because how do you go and tell basically people in India living on $1,000, $2,000 a day, hey, you guys can only have like per capita emissions that are 150 US, because and that's a really hard argument to make before there was a functioning global order. And what we're seeing now is there's a lack of global leadership. Right after the crisis, there will still be an attempt to rebuild the global order, but it won't be nearly as robust as seen today. And so there will be much less of an emphasis on these global coordinating mechanisms, and that will lead to a higher emphasis on mitigation of global warming. So instead of trying to reduce carbon emissions, it will be build walls in Miami for the higher sea levels. And I think, though, when we think about like the role of special economic zones and charter cities, one of the important questions is the degree of the supply chain integration. And I think we're going to see a more limited supply chain integration, just because right now, the US military holds together global supply chains. And with China challenging that, and with the WHO obviously being in China's pocket, there's going to be much less trust of these global institutions. And the US is already sort of pulling back from global engagement, and will likely continue to do that post-crisis. The speed obviously remains to be determined, which will then allow for regional players, Iran, Turkey, Russia, et cetera, to sort of reassert themselves, as well as basically necessitate more limited supply chains and more emphasis on generality, which is why what we do with the Charter Cities Institute is focus on charter cities qua cities. So not trying to create a link in the supply chain, right? Like the charter city needs to engage with the general supply chain, but it's not just here is a specific link, here is a tool that we can put there, but here is a city, here is a polity that allows for this more general sense of economic activity that is more resilient to these types of shocks, that can create the type of wealth that can deal with the very rapidly urbanizing populations in Africa as well as Asia, and really have a more general model that we believe is more suited for the future environment in a post-COVID world.
Yeah, just want to say, I think Mark's on the cutting edge. He's on the future, as is probably everybody here, of charter cities. Because, formerly SEZs were just about reducing one kind of regulation, basically excise and duties, right? And that's just not as important. For the reasons Mark said, and as Jim pointed out, international trade is dropping. So now the future of special jurisdictions is not after that one little thing, excise, duties, customs. That's the littlest part of the picture. It's going to be broader liberalization of regulations and taxes and laws. So yes, that's the future.
Right on. Tom, a great note to end the main segment of the panel on. And we have 7 minutes left in this panel. So what I think I'd like to do right now is open up questions to the chat that we have just under 140 people in right now. And if possible, I'd like to get some questions going in the chat. And there's already one from a gentleman from Brazil called Claudio Chiquida. And the question is, I would love to hear an example of a hypothetical SEZ helping a country to fight COVID-19. Which practical aspects of governance should an SEZ be able to change? Anybody in particular want to tackle that one?
I'll go really quickly because I want to hear from others. We need one in the SEZ that cuts back on CDC and FDA regulations on personal protective equipment. We needed that several weeks ago. We need it now. And also, as I noted, with regard to Orange County's relationship to the state of California, we need to set it up so HOAs and larger, not self-sufficient, but big, diverse communities can basically wall off the outside world if they want to. And right now they can't. You got to count on your local political sheriff to help you out. And we need more flexible, smaller responses.
So I'm not sure there is setting up an SEZ takes time, and setting up the practice and procedures take time. And so I'm not sure there is an SEZ that could help fight COVID right now that if you start now, it could presumably, if you set it up now, help fight the next crisis, but just in terms of the timeline of establishment, right, it's a lot of work to build these things. What I would say is one of my favorite examples about fighting a pandemic isn't from COVID, it's from Ebola, where there was, it's not even an SEZ, it was just a plantation, a Firestone plantation, rubber plantation. And it was in Liberia. Ebola was killing a lot of people, and it had about 80,000 people in the plantation. And they realized, hey, this is killing people. They didn't have any medical expertise. They just basically Googled, right, like, what are the steps you can take to limit the spread of Ebola? And they realized, okay, right, you want to quarantine, limit access from the outside, and then if people get sick, you need to be right. Ebola spreads very quickly. Basically, have a lot of protective gear, and with that, they managed in the country that is very poor, has low state capacity, to have 0 deaths from Ebola in their population of 80,000 people. And so, to me, it's right. Like, yes, SEZ is a tool, but what you really need is competent governance. And so one of the other questions I saw was, what do you disagree with other panelists on? With Tom, I would say we don't need a special economic zone with no CDC and FDA. We need the whole US to have a much changed role of CDC and FDA. And on a specific level, right, like even if you have the SEZ with the PPE, right, to sell to the rest of the US, you need the FDA to get on board. So, right, like in terms of drugs and medical devices to sell to the broader market, you need FDA approval. And so even if you get a zone that allows for experimentation there, right, like that hopefully allows to change the broader conversation. But given the sort of short time horizons we're working on, with something like that, I just try to force it through on the national level.
And just one comment, this is a good question from another SEC expert, actually. I agree with those kind of shorter term views, absolutely right. And then in the long term, I think that one thing that people underestimate is how long this crisis is going to go on. It's not really a crisis. It's a gradual change to a different way of living. We're probably going to live with this for around 3 years or so. And I think that this is a great opportunity for the special communities, private cities. And it touches on kind of things that Mark was saying here. One of the big questions that people are trying to ask is like, on the one hand, we kind of want authoritarian government now to shut us all down. On the other hand, we got a lot of problems with that as free people. And I think that the case for having free cities where you are signing a contract where you can sign different contracts grows stronger when the issue is, how much are we going to impose on you you need an app on your phone so that we know where you are all the time. You need to quarantine once you've been in the grocery store. All those kind of things. There's going to be different preferences for that. And the ability to people to live in different jurisdictions, say, here we're freer and we're taking the risk, and maybe we're investing more in healthcare in exchange. And here, I want just everybody to be super quarantined and spray, sanitizer in my face if they see me. That could be completely different preferences, and we could accommodate for that. Because I feel like now is one of the problems is that people who like freedom still are just fine with the government coming in because they don't see another solution. They don't see the decentralized solution to this.
Closing word, because we're ending in 2 minutes. So any nice thoughts that we can end on?
In response to the hypothetical SEZ, what does it do to help? Well, what does your SEZ do in the first place? What does it make, and who does it make it for? Because if your SEZ is all about exporting stuff to other places, I'm not sure how much good it's going to do to help you. The one thing SEZs and every bit of the economy can do to help right now is help people not lose their jobs. Now, if that works through some kind of incentivization or fiscal management, then yeah, that would be great.
I want to tell you a quick little thing about Ragasta. The Free Republic of Ragasta in the Adriatic lasted for 450 years. It was basically a city-state, and it invented quarantine. So the most advanced technology of its day for fighting pandemics, it was developed in Ragasta, a free city.
Cool.
A note to end on. Jim, Lotta, Mark, Tom, I want to thank you for probably the best panel that I've engaged in the past year or so. It's been very insightful, I think, for the past, present, and future of the SEZ field. And what I think I want to do right now is hand it over to the MCs for the next segment. Cheers, guys.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. God bless.